The night sky over ancient Persia was a velvet tapestry of countless stars, their silver light washing over a landscape of rolling highlands and rugged mountains. Here, in the cradle of civilization, where the gentle winds carried whispers of ancient wisdom across the land, our story begins. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time to the 6th century before the Common Era, when the world was young and full of wonder. In these lands, among the Median and Persian tribes, lived a boy named Cyrus. Born to nobility but raised with humility, young Cyrus grew under the vast open skies of what we now call Iran. His childhood was spent listening to tales of tribal glory while gazing upon distant mountains that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. The elders spoke of unity and strength, of a time when their scattered peoples might stand as one. Imagine the soft glow of firelight illuminating the faces of tribal elders as they gathered to share stories of their ancestors. The flames cast dancing shadows on stone walls, while outside, the cool desert night enveloped their settlements in peaceful darkness. It was in these quiet moments that the seeds of empire were first planted in the mind of young Cyrus. As a young man, Cyrus possessed an uncommon wisdom. His voice was measured and thoughtful, his eyes reflecting both compassion and unwavering resolve. Unlike the harsh conquerors of neighboring lands, Cyrus understood that true power came not from terror or brutality, but from respect and tolerance. This philosophy would come to define his approach to empire building, setting him apart from all who came before. The Persian tribes were proud and independent, each with their own customs and ways. They roamed the plateaus with their herds, following ancient paths worn smooth by centuries of seasonal migrations. The Medes, their cousins to the north, had established dominance, but their rule was beginning to fray under the weight of internal strife. The region was a mosaic of peoples, Elamites, Babylonians, Lydians, each with their own gods, languages, and dreams. When Cyrus came of age, the landscape of power was shifting. The great empires of Babylon and Egypt were entering twilight years, while the Median king Astyages, who happened to be Cyrus's grandfather through marriage alliances, ruled with an increasingly unstable hand. The time was ripe for change, though few could have imagined the scale of transformation that was to come. In the year 550 BCE, with the patient deliberation that would become his hallmark, Cyrus united the Persian tribes. Picture him standing before the assembled clan leaders, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. He spoke not of conquest, but of shared destiny, of protection and prosperity for all who would join him. One by one, the tribal chieftains pledged their loyalty, binding their fortunes to his vision. With this united force, Cyrus turned his attention to the Medes. Rather than approaching as an aggressor, he positioned himself as a liberator from the increasingly tyrannical rule of Astyages. The campaign was swift and remarkably bloodless. Many Median nobles, recognizing Cyrus's wisdom and fair-mindedness, simply opened their gates and welcomed him. By autumn, as golden leaves drifted down from trees in the Median capital of Ecbatana, Cyrus entered the city not as a conqueror, but as its new king, greeted with flowers and songs rather than fear. Imagine the scene as Cyrus walked through Ecbatana for the first time as its ruler. The city's famous 7 walls, each painted a different color, gleamed in the sunlight. People lined the streets, curious and cautiously hopeful. Unlike other victorious leaders who might have stripped the city of its treasures or punished its people, Cyrus retained Median officials in their positions and honored their customs. This pattern of respectful integration would become the cornerstone of his empire-building strategy. With the Median kingdom incorporated into his realm, Cyrus now ruled a significant territory stretching across the Iranian plateau. But his vision extended further. To the west lay wealthy Lydia, ruled by the legendary King Croesus, whose name had become synonymous with unimaginable wealth. Beyond Lydia were the Greek city-states of Ionia, centers of commerce and learning. To the east were the Bactrians and Sogdians, fierce horsemen of the steppes, and to the south the ancient and venerable civilization of Babylon, with its hanging gardens and ziggurats reaching toward the heavens. In 547 BCE, when the mountain passes cleared of winter snow, Cyrus turned his attention westward. Croesus of Lydia, believing the time was right to challenge this rising power, had consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's famously ambiguous response that if Croesus attacked Persia, a great empire would fall, gave the Lydian king false confidence. He did not consider that the empire to fall might be his own. The armies met on the plains near the Halys River, where the flowing grasses whispered in the wind. Croesus commanded a formidable force, including the finest cavalry known to the ancient world. Cyrus, however, displayed the tactical genius that would become legendary. Recognizing the Lydian horse's fear of camels, he placed his camel corps at the front of his battle line. The scent and sight of these unfamiliar beasts caused the Lydian cavalry to rear and retreat in confusion, breaking their carefully planned formation. Despite this advantage, the battle was closely contested, ending without clear victory for either side. As autumn approached, Croesus assumed the Persians would withdraw for the winter and began dismissing his own troops. But Cyrus, defying convention, pursued the Lydians to their capital at Sardis. The city, built upon a seemingly impregnable acropolis, had never fallen to an outside force. For 2 weeks, Sardis held firm against the Persian siege. Then, a Persian soldier noticed a defender's helmet accidentally dropped from the battlements. He watched as the Lydian climbed down a nearly invisible path on the supposedly unscalable cliff face to retrieve it. That night, a small Persian force followed this same path, gaining entry to the citadel. By morning, the Persian standard flew over Sardis, and Croesus was Cyrus's prisoner. In keeping with his character, Cyrus treated the defeated king with dignity. According to some accounts, so impressed was he by Croesus's wisdom and acceptance of fate that he made the former king an advisor, valuing his knowledge of the lands and peoples to the west. This pattern, conquest followed by respectful integration, would become the hallmark of Cyrus's expanding empire. With Lydia incorporated into his dominions, Cyrus now controlled a vast territory spanning much of what we today call the Middle East. The coastal Greek cities that had been under Lydian control now faced a choice: accept Persian overlordship or resist. Some submitted peacefully, while others prepared for resistance. Cyrus, busy consolidating his gains and planning his next major campaign, left the management of these distant territories to trusted generals and satraps. regional governors who would collect taxes and maintain order while allowing significant local autonomy. As the stars wheeled overhead and seasons passed in gentle succession, Cyrus's reputation grew. He was known not just as a military leader of unparalleled skill, but as a ruler of wisdom and mercy. Stories spread of his justice, his respect for the gods of conquered peoples, his willingness to embrace and preserve local customs rather than impose Persian ways. In an age often characterized by brutal suppression of the defeated, Cyrus's approach was revolutionary. With each new territory added to his realm, the administrative challenges grew. Cyrus began developing the systems that would later be perfected by his successors: networks of roads to facilitate communication, standardized weights and measures to promote trade, and a decentralized system of governance that allowed for local customs while ensuring loyalty to the greater empire. As night deepens and our story continues to unfold, imagine Cyrus in his tent, poring over maps by lamplight, planning his most ambitious conquest yet. Beyond the eastern mountains lay Babylon, the oldest and greatest city in the known world, seat of ancient learning and power. Its ziggurats reached to the heavens, its walls were said to be impenetrable, and its rulers claimed direct descent from the gods themselves. Yet even this mighty civilization would soon become part of the growing Persian Empire, in what would perhaps be Cyrus's most remarkable achievement of all. But that is a tale for our next chapter, as we follow the rise of the first true world empire, built not primarily through force of arms, but through the revolutionary concepts of tolerance, respect, and inclusive governance that would become Cyrus's lasting legacy. As your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, picture the vast landscapes of ancient Persia. Mountains touching the clouds, deserts blazing gold in the setting sun, fertile valleys where the first farming communities took root thousands of years before. In this cradle of human civilization, Cyrus the Great was laying the foundations for an empire unlike any the world had seen before, one whose echoes would resonate through history for millennia to come. Chapter 2: Babylon's Fall. As the gentle night deepens around us, let us continue our journey through the ancient world, following the footsteps of Cyrus the Great as he turns his gaze toward the legendary city of Babylon. The year is 539 BCE, and the Persian Empire, still young and vibrant, stands poised before its greatest conquest yet. Imagine, if you will, the city of Babylon as it stood then, an urban wonder without equal in the ancient world. Its massive walls, so thick that chariot races were said to be held atop them, encircled a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls. The Euphrates River flowed through its heart, bridged by magnificent stone spans. The famed hanging gardens terraced up toward the sky, a lush paradise of flowers and trees sustained by ingenious hydraulic systems. At the city's center rose the great ziggurat Etemenanke, a seven-tiered mountain of mud brick dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. This was the tower that inspired the biblical story of Babel, its summit reaching toward the heavens themselves. For nearly 2,000 years, Babylon had been the center of civilization in Mesopotamia, the birthplace of writing, codified law, astronomy, and mathematics. Its libraries held clay tablets containing the sum of human knowledge. Its markets teemed with goods from India to Egypt. Its priests and scholars were renowned throughout the known world. Yet despite this glorious heritage, Babylon in Cyrus's time was a city in quiet crisis. Its king, Nabonidus, had alienated the powerful priesthood by favoring the moon god Sin over Marduk. Worse, he had been absent from the city for years, choosing to live in the distant oasis of Tema, leaving his son Belshazzar as regent. The complex religious ceremonies that had bound king and city together for millennia went unperformed, and dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface of daily life. This internal discord presented an opportunity that Cyrus, with his remarkable political instinct, recognized immediately. Rather than presenting himself as a foreign conqueror, he positioned himself as a liberator who would restore proper worship and traditional ways. Persian agents moved quietly through the city, speaking to priests and merchants, planting seeds of welcome rather than resistance. As summer faded into autumn in 539 BCE, Cyrus led his army toward Babylon. The journey took them along the Tigris River, through lands that were already ancient when Cyrus was born. Shepherds watched from hillsides as the Persian forces passed, the dust from their march rising like gentle mist in the morning light. Villages emptied as people lined the roads to glimpse the man whose reputation for justice and mercy had spread far beyond his borders. Nabonidus, belatedly recognizing the threat, hastened back to Babylon from his self-imposed exile. He gathered his forces for a confrontation at Opis, north of the city. But here again, Cyrus's reputation preceded him. When the armies met, many Babylonian soldiers simply laid down their arms, unwilling to fight for a king who had neglected his sacred duties. Nabonidus fled back to Babylon, hoping its legendary defenses would protect him, where his army had not. Now picture the Persian forces approaching the mighty city as autumn deepened. The setting sun gilded Babylon's walls and towers, making them glow like a vision from a dream. The Babylonians had prepared for a long siege, stockpiling food and ensuring the river gates were securely barred. Yet no siege engines appeared on the horizon. Instead, Cyrus implemented one of the most brilliant strategic maneuvers in ancient military history. The Euphrates River, lifeblood of Babylon, entered and exited the city through massive grated openings in the walls. Upstream from the city, Cyrus ordered his engineers to dig channels diverting part of the river's flow. Gradually, imperceptibly, the water level began to drop. On the night chosen for the assault, a night of festival within the city, when attention to defense would be at its lowest, the river had fallen enough that Persian soldiers could wade through the waist-deep channel under the walls and into Babylon itself. Inside the royal palace, King Belshazzar feasted with his nobles, drinking wine from golden vessels that his father Nabonidus had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. According to the biblical account in the book of Daniel, it was at this very banquet that a mysterious hand appeared and wrote on the wall the famous words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Whether this actually occurred or is legendary embellishment, the prophecy proved true that very night. As darkness enveloped the revelry, Persian troops moved silently through the city. They secured key points, the palace, the temples, the city gates, with minimal bloodshed. Most Babylonians, waking the next morning, discovered they were already under new rule. The transition so smooth that daily life continued almost without interruption. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a vengeful conqueror, but as its legitimate king. He went immediately to the temple of Marduk, participating in the sacred rituals and taking the hands of Bel, the ceremony by which Babylonian kings received divine sanction for their rule. He issued a proclamation, recorded on a clay cylinder, that has survived to our time, declaring his respect for Babylon's gods, traditions, and people. Far from imposing Persian ways, he presented himself as a traditionalist who would restore proper worship and just governance. One of Cyrus's most significant acts in Babylon was the liberation of peoples who had been displaced by previous Babylonian rulers. Most famous among these were the Jews, who had been brought to Babylon as captives after Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem some 50 years earlier. Cyrus not only permitted them to return to their homeland, but also authorized the rebuilding of their temple and the restoration of sacred vessels that had been taken as spoils of war. This policy, recorded in both Persian documents and in the biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles, was extraordinary for its time. Rather than forcing conquered peoples to assimilate, Cyrus recognized that allowing cultural and religious autonomy would create more stable, loyal territories within his growing empire. The Jews would remember this act of mercy for generations, with the biblical prophet Isaiah even referring to Cyrus as God's anointed one, or Messiah, a title otherwise reserved for Israelite kings and the future Savior. But the Jews were not the only beneficiaries of Cyrus's enlightened policies. Throughout his newly expanded empire, local religions were respected, traditional governance structures maintained where they proved effective, and regional customs honored. What Cyrus created was not so much a Persian empire as a universal state where diverse peoples could maintain their identities while participating in a greater whole. The conquest of Babylon marked the zenith of Cyrus's achievements. In a single stroke, he had gained control of Mesopotamia, Syria, and the trade routes leading to the Mediterranean. The Persian Empire now stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River Valley, encompassing most of what we today call the Middle East. It was, without question, the largest empire the world had yet seen, and it had been built largely through Cyrus's remarkable combination of military brilliance and political wisdom. In the years following the Babylonian conquest, Cyrus continued to consolidate his vast domains. He established his winter capital at Babylon, taking advantage of its milder climate and ancient prestige, while maintaining his Persian capitals at Pasargadae and Susa for other seasons. He initiated construction projects throughout his realm, strengthening infrastructure and beautifying cities that showed loyalty. The administration of such an enormous territory required innovation. Cyrus divided his empire into provinces or satrapies, each governed by a satrap, literally protector of the kingdom, who was usually a Persian noble or trusted ally. These satraps collected taxes, maintained order, and administered justice, while significant local autonomy remained in the hands of traditional leaders. A network of royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king, traveled the empire to ensure satraps governed justly and remained loyal. To facilitate communication across these vast distances, Cyrus began what his successor would expand into the royal road system, a network of well-maintained highways, complete with posting stations where royal couriers could obtain fresh horses and supplies. Messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days rather than weeks, an administrative advantage that helped bind together these diverse lands. As we pause in our narrative, imagine the elderly Cyrus looking out over Babylon from a palace terrace as the evening star appears in the darkening sky. Below him, the city continues its eternal rhythms, merchants closing their stalls in the marketplace, priests tending temple fires, children being called home for evening meals. From the ziggurats, astronomical observations continue that will one day form the foundation of Greek and later Arabic science. In the scribal schools, young men press cuneiform characters into clay tablets, preserving knowledge that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. All of this now exists within a new context, the Pax Persica, or Persian peace, a time of relative stability and prosperity under the benevolent rule of a king whose vision transcended the narrow ethnic and religious boundaries that had limited previous empires. Though he could not know it, Cyrus was establishing a template for multicultural governance that would influence imperial systems for millennia to come, from Alexander's brief realm to the Roman, Byzantine, and later Islamic empires. Yet even this remarkable man was mortal. In 530 BCE, while campaigning against nomadic tribes in the far northeastern reaches of his empire, Cyrus the Great fell in battle. He was buried in his capital at Pasargadae, in a simple but elegant tomb that still stands today. 6 stone tiers supporting a modest chamber, once containing a golden sarcophagus in which the king's body lay. The epitaph attributed to him by the Greek historian Plutarch seems fitting. O man, whoever you are, and wherever you come from, for I know that you will come, I am Cyrus who founded the Persian Empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body. As the stars emerge one by one in the night sky above us, Cyrus's legacy continues. His son Cambyses would soon add Egypt to the empire, fulfilling his father's unfinished ambitions. And after a period of unrest following Cambyses's death, a new king would rise to lead Persia to even greater heights of organizational genius and cultural achievement. But that is a story for our next chapter, as we follow the golden thread of Persian greatness through the veils of time. As you drift toward sleep, envision once more the glory of ancient Babylon, its towers and gardens bathed in moonlight, now part of an empire built on wisdom as much as warfare. The lasting achievement of Cyrus the Great, whose name would echo through the corridors of history as the epitome of the enlightened ruler. Chapter 3: Darius the Great and the Golden Age. The night deepens as our story continues, carrying us forward to a new chapter in the grand tapestry of the Persian Empire. The passing of Cyrus the Great in 530 BCE left his son Cambyses II to inherit the vast domain his father had built. Cambyses soon embarked on the conquest of Egypt, fulfilling his father's unrealized ambition and adding the ancient land of the pharaohs to the Persian realm. Yet fate can turn like autumn leaves in the wind. In 522 BCE, as Cambyses was returning from Egypt, mysterious circumstances led to his death. Some ancient accounts suggest an accident. Others whisper of suicide, while still others hint at darker intrigues. Whatever the truth, the empire was suddenly thrown into uncertainty. Into this moment of crisis stepped a remarkable figure, Darius, a distant cousin of Cambyses and commander in the elite corps of royal spearmen. According to his own account, inscribed on the towering rock face at Behistun, Darius discovered that a magus named Gaumata had usurped the throne, impersonating Cambyses' brother Bardia, whom Cambyses had secretly executed before the Egyptian campaign. Whether this tale of imposture was truth or convenient fiction to legitimize his own claim, Darius moved decisively. Gathering 6 other noble Persian conspirators, he assassinated the alleged usurper and claimed the throne for himself. The transition was not smooth. 19 battles against 9 rival claimants would be fought before Darius could rest secure in his kingship. Yet by 521 BCE, all challengers had been defeated, and the empire was once again united under a single ruler. Darius I, who would come to be known as Darius the Great, now turned his formidable organizational talents to the task of governance. Where Cyrus had been the inspired founder and conqueror, Darius would be the administrator and builder who transformed a collection of conquered territories into a coherent imperial system that would function smoothly for 2 centuries. Imagine, if you will, Darius in the early years of his reign, working tirelessly by lamplight in his palace chambers. Before him are laid maps showing territories stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, from the steppes of Central Asia to the cataracts of the Nile. How does one man govern such vastness? How can orders from the center reach the distant periphery? How can wealth flow back to support the imperial structure? Darius's solutions were brilliant in their pragmatism. He refined the satrapy system begun under Cyrus, dividing the empire into 20 provinces, each under a governor or satrap who was usually a Persian noble. To prevent these powerful officials from developing independent power bases, Darius instituted a system of checks and balances. A separate military commander in each satrapy reported directly to the king. So did a royal secretary who observed and documented the satrap's actions. And traveling through the realm were the king's inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, who could appear unannounced at any provincial court to investigate complaints or simply assess the quality of governance. To bind this system together, Darius expanded the royal road network. The main artery stretched nearly 1,700 miles from Sardis near the Aegean coast to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Well maintained and patrolled to ensure traveler safety, the road was dotted with posting stations approximately a day's journey apart. Here, royal couriers could obtain fresh horses, food, and shelter. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled that these couriers could cover the entire distance from Sardis to Susa in just 7 days, a journey that would take a normal traveler 90 days to complete. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed, wrote Herodotus in a phrase later adopted by the United States Postal Service. This efficient communication system was the nervous system of the empire, allowing for coordinated governance across vast distances in an age when news normally traveled at the pace of a walking man. Darius also standardized the legal codes throughout the empire, allowing for local laws to remain in effect where they did not conflict with Persian imperial interests. He established a common set of weights and measures to facilitate trade and instituted the first comprehensive imperial coinage system. The golden daric and silver siglos became standard currency throughout the realm, bearing the image of the king as an archer, a potent symbol of Persian military might. Perhaps most significantly, Darius reformed the tax system, establishing fixed assessments for each satrapy based on its agricultural productivity and wealth. These taxes could be paid in coin, precious metals, or in-kind contributions appropriate to each region's resources: horses from Media, gold from India, grain from Egypt. This predictable taxation replaced the arbitrary tribute demands of earlier empires, allowing provinces to plan their economies and even prosper under Persian rule. With these administrative foundations firmly established, Darius turned his attention to more visible manifestations of imperial glory. In 518 BCE, he began construction of a new ceremonial capital at Persepolis, the city of the Persians, in the highlands of his native Fars province. Built atop a massive terrace partly carved from the mountainside, Persepolis was designed to awe and impress visitors from throughout the empire and beyond. Close your eyes and envision approaching Persepolis in its prime. The road leads you to a grand staircase, designed with such shallow steps that horses could ascend it with dignity. At the top stands the Gate of All Nations, flanked by massive winged bull sculptures with human heads, protective spirits adopted from Assyrian tradition but given Persian artistic interpretation. Passing through this imposing entrance, you enter a world of breathtaking architectural beauty. The Apadana, or audience hall, could accommodate thousands of visitors beneath its soaring cedar columns, 72 in total, each 66 feet high and topped with elaborate capitals. The walls were adorned with intricate reliefs showing representatives of all 23 nations of the empire, bringing gifts to the king during the New Year festival. Here was the empire made visible: Ethiopians with ivory, Bactrians leading camels, Lydians with vessels of precious metal, Indians with gold dust and exotic animals. Each delegation is depicted with careful attention to ethnic features, clothing, and characteristic products, a celebration of diversity within unity. Beyond the Apadana lay the Takara, Darius's private palace, and the vast treasury where the wealth of empire was stored. Everywhere, master craftsmen had created works of stunning artistry: staircases adorned with processions of immortals, the elite Persian guard, servants bearing dishes of food and drink, nobles in formal Persian court dress. The stone was polished to a high sheen and painted in vibrant colors that have long since faded, though traces remain to this day. At night, thousands of oil lamps would have illuminated these spaces, making the glazed bricks sparkle and the gold and silver accents gleam in their light. Persepolis was not the only capital of the Persian Empire. Darius maintained several royal cities, including Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, moving his court seasonally to enjoy the best climate each location offered. Yet Persepolis held special significance as the spiritual homeland of the Persian people and the site of the most important imperial ceremonies, particularly Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebration held at the spring equinox. Under Darius's patronage, Persian culture flourished as never before. The king himself was a devotee of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith founded by the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. This religion, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced faiths, taught the existence of a single creator god, Ahura Mazda, and emphasized the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Its central ethical precept, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, aligned well with the Persian imperial ideal of just governance. While Darius personally followed Zoroastrian practices, he maintained the Persian tradition of religious tolerance established by Cyrus. Throughout the empire, local faiths continued undisturbed, often receiving royal patronage. In Egypt, Darius commissioned temples to local gods and presented himself as a pharaoh in Egyptian art. In Judea, he supported the completion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, continuing Cyrus's policy of respect for Jewish autonomy. This period also saw significant cultural exchange throughout the vast Persian domains. Ideas, artistic techniques, and technologies flowed along the trade routes that connected distant parts of the empire. Persian artists incorporated elements from Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek traditions while maintaining their own distinctive aesthetic. Persian luxury goods, intricate metalwork, finely woven carpets, and elaborate jewelry were prized throughout the ancient world. The peace and prosperity of Darius's reign allowed for intellectual and scientific advancement as well. Persian astronomers, building on Babylonian foundations, refined methods for predicting celestial events. Engineers developed sophisticated irrigation systems using underground channels called qanats to bring water from distant mountains to arid plains. Some of these ancient waterworks remain functional in Iran even today, a testament to their ingenious design. Medicine, too, flourished under Persian patronage. Darius established medical schools where physicians from Greek, Egyptian, and Indian traditions could exchange knowledge. The resulting Persian medical tradition, emphasizing both preventive practices and herbal remedies, would later influence the development of Islamic medicine, which in turn would preserve and transmit much ancient medical knowledge to medieval Europe. Yet for all his administrative genius and cultural patronage, Darius was also a military leader, determined to expand the boundaries of his realm. In 519 BCE, he led an expedition across the Hellespont into Europe, subjugating Thrace and forcing Macedonia to acknowledge Persian overlordship. In 513 BCE, he campaigned against the Scythians, nomadic horsemen of the Ukrainian steppes. Though this latter expedition ended inconclusively, it demonstrated Persian power projection into regions previously beyond imperial reach. More successful was Darius's eastern campaign to the Indus River Valley, which added rich new territories to the empire and opened trade routes to India. The wealth flowing from these conquests funded the magnificent building projects and cultural efflorescence that characterized his reign. Yet it was a relatively minor campaign that would set in motion events leading to the empire's first major setback. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia, on what is now Turkey's Aegean coast, rebelled against Persian rule. Athens and Eretria, two city-states from mainland Greece, sent ships to aid the rebels. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, Darius vowed to punish these meddling powers from across the sea. In 490 BCE, a Persian expeditionary force crossed the Aegean, quickly subduing several islands and destroying Eretria. But at Marathon, on the plain outside Athens, the unexpected occurred. The Athenians, though outnumbered, charged directly at the Persian lines, concentrating their strength against the enemy center while thinning their own wings. The bold tactic worked. The Persian line broke, and the invasion force was driven back to its ships with heavy losses. The Battle of Marathon, though merely a setback to the vast Persian Empire, would take on mythic significance in Western historical memory. For the Greeks, it became a founding moment in their self-identification as defenders of freedom against Eastern despotism. A narrative that, though highly simplified and culturally biased, would influence European thought for millennia. For Darius, Marathon was a minor irritation, a distant border skirmish that hardly affected the empire's power and prosperity. He began preparing a larger expedition to conclusively deal with the Greek problem, but time, the unconquerable adversary of all mortals, intervened. In 486 BCE, after 36 years of transformative rule, Darius the Great died, leaving his son Xerxes to inherit both his mighty empire and his unfinished business with the Greeks. As the stars wheel slowly overhead and the night deepens around us, we leave Darius to his eternal rest in his magnificent tomb carved into the cliff face at Naksh-e-Rustam, near Persepolis. Inside, his sarcophagus once lay, surrounded by precious grave goods befitting his status, gold and silver vessels, jewelry of exquisite craftsmanship, fine textiles, and weapons signifying his role as warrior king. Though grave robbers would later strip these treasures away, nothing could diminish the more important legacy he left. A system of governance so effective that it would serve as a model for later empires, a cultural flowering that would influence art and architecture for centuries to come, and an approach to ruling diverse peoples that emphasized inclusion rather than forced assimilation. As your consciousness begins to drift toward the threshold of dreams, picture once more the glory of Persepolis in the golden light of sunset. The massive terrace gleams, its palaces and halls standing proud against the backdrop of mountains. Diplomats from distant lands climb the grand staircase, marveling at the wealth and organizational prowess of an empire that has transformed the ancient world. In the audience chamber, seated on his throne, Darius receives them with the dignity and wisdom that have earned him the epithet, the Great. The Persian Empire has reached its zenith under his guidance, a vast, interconnected realm where diverse peoples live in relative peace and prosperity, united under the benevolent authority of the King of Kings. But all golden ages eventually face challenges, and the seeds of future conflict have already been sown on the distant shores of the Aegean. How the empire will weather these storms remains to be seen, as our story continues to unfold in the chapters yet to come. Chapter 4. Wars of Expansion. As the gentle veil of night envelops us once more, let us journey further through the corridors of time, following the grand tapestry of the Persian Empire as it continues to unfold. With the passing of Darius the Great in 486 BCE, the imperial mantle fell to his son, Xerxes, a prince raised in the shadow of magnificence, educated from birth for the responsibilities of universal kingship. Xerxes ascended to the throne during a time of relative stability. The administrative systems established by his father functioned smoothly. The imperial treasuries were full, and the vast network of provinces generally accepted Persian overlordship as legitimate. Yet, like ripples disturbing the surface of still water, challenges were emerging at the empire's periphery. In Egypt, always a land proud of its ancient heritage and resistant to foreign rule, rebellion had broken out in the final years of Darius's reign. Shortly after his coronation, Xerxes led a substantial force into the Nile Delta, where he suppressed the uprising with firm resolve. Unlike his predecessors, who had taken care to present themselves as legitimate pharaohs respecting Egyptian traditions, Xerxes took a harder line, reducing Egyptian autonomy and imposing more direct Persian control. This successful reassertion of authority in the southwest allowed Xerxes to turn his attention to the unfinished business his father had left in the northwest, the matter of the Greeks. The defeat at Marathon, though minor in the grand scope of imperial concerns, remained a diplomatic thorn that needed to be addressed. More importantly, the independent Greek city-states represented potential instability on the empire's western frontier, a situation contrary to the Persian ideal of universal order. Preparations for a major expedition began almost immediately after Xerxes secured the throne. Unlike his father's relatively modest, punitive raid, Xerxes envisioned a comprehensive campaign that would bring all of Greece within the Persian sphere, thus securing the empire's western flank once and for all. The scale of planning was unprecedented even by Persian standards. For 3 years, from 484 to 481 BCE, resources flowed from across the empire toward this single purpose. Imagine the scene as this vast enterprise took shape. In shipyards along the Phoenician coast, master craftsmen supervised the construction of hundreds of triremes, their hammers echoing across calm waters as the distinctive 3-tiered warships took form. Grain from Egypt and the Fertile Crescent was stockpiled at strategic points along the projected route of march. In Sardis, the western administrative capital, messengers arrived daily from distant provinces, reporting on contingents of troops being assembled, specialized equipment being manufactured, and supplies being gathered. Perhaps most impressive were the engineering works commissioned to support the expedition. Near the site of ancient Troy, where the Hellespont narrows between Asia and Europe, Persian engineers constructed pontoon bridges nearly a mile long by anchoring hundreds of ships side by side and laying wooden planking across them. When a storm destroyed this first attempt, Xerxes, according to Herodotus, had the waters symbolically whipped for their insolence, before ordering the bridges rebuilt even more securely. Further north, at the peninsula of Mount Athos, where a Persian fleet had been wrecked during Darius's reign, a canal was dug across the narrow isthmus, allowing ships to avoid the treacherous waters around the mountainous headland. Though some modern historians have questioned whether this canal was actually completed, archaeological evidence confirms that the project was at least begun, demonstrating the empire's vast resources and engineering capacity. By the spring of 480 BCE, all was in readiness. The Persian host that assembled at Sardis was less an army than a moving city, representing the full diversity of the empire's peoples. At its core were the 10,000 immortals, the elite Persian infantry whose ranks were always maintained at full strength. When one fell in battle or to illness, another was immediately promoted to take his place, creating the impression of an immortal force. Around this professional nucleus gathered specialized troops from across the imperial domains, Bactrian and Sogdian horsemen from the eastern steppes, archers from Media and Elam, Assyrian and Babylonian infantry, Egyptian marines, and contingents from dozens of other nations, each with their distinctive weapons, armor, and fighting styles. Herodotus, whose account remains our primary source despite its pro-Greek bias, claimed the Persian forces numbered 2.6 million fighting men plus an equal number of support personnel. Modern historians consider these figures greatly exaggerated, suggesting the actual numbers were closer to 200,000 troops and 800 ships, still an overwhelming force by ancient standards, the largest military assemblage the world had yet seen. In early summer, as the first light of dawn glinted on spear points, and the morning breeze carried the scents of varied cuisines from 100 campfires, the grand procession began its march toward the Hellespont. Herodotus describes the crossing in vivid detail. First came altars and sacred fires attended by Zoroastrian priests. Then the 10,000 immortals adorned with golden pomegranates on their spear butts, followed by Xerxes himself in a chariot drawn by sacred Nisaean horses. Behind the king stretched mile upon mile of troops, camp followers, and baggage trains, a human river flowing from Asia into Europe. After crossing into Thrace, the Persian juggernaut moved westward along the coast, where their fleet sailed parallel to their path. Subject peoples along the route had prepared food and lodging for the vast host, though Herodotus claims these preparations often proved inadequate, with communities nearly bankrupted by the demands of hospitality. Macedonia, already a Persian client state, provided bases and supplies as the expedition approached the Greek heartland. The Greek response to this existential threat was fragmented. Many northern Greek states, including Thessaly and Thebes, chose to medize, that is, to accept Persian overlordship, judging resistance futile against such overwhelming force. Others, led by Athens and Sparta, formed a defensive alliance, though even within this coalition, disagreements about strategy were constant and bitter. As the vast Persian host moved south from Macedonia, its first significant resistance came at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the mountains reach almost to the sea, creating a natural bottleneck. Here, a Greek force of approximately 7,000, including 300 Spartan elite warriors led by King Leonidas, took up position to block the Persian advance. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass against repeated Persian assaults. The narrow terrain negated the Persians' numerical advantage, allowing the heavily armored Greek hoplites to form an effective defensive wall with their overlapping shields. Even the immortals, Xerxes' finest troops, failed to break through. The tactical situation changed dramatically when a local Greek, either motivated by reward or fear, revealed to the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to outflank the defenders. Learning that his position would soon be surrounded, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied contingents, remaining with his 300 Spartans, about 700 Thespians who refused to withdraw, and 400 Thebans to fight a desperate rear-guard action, while the main Greek force retreated. The final stand of Leonidas and his men would become legendary, the epitome of heroic sacrifice against overwhelming odds. Yet, from a strategic perspective, while the Greeks had been defeated at Thermopylae, they had inflicted disproportionate casualties on the Persian force and, more importantly, gained precious time for the evacuation of Athens and further defensive preparations. Simultaneously with the land battle at Thermopylae, the naval engagement at nearby Artemisium ended in a tactical draw, though the Greek fleet withdrew upon learning of the land force's defeat. The way to Athens now lay open, and in September of 480 BCE, Persian forces entered the evacuated city. In a gesture laden with symbolic significance, Xerxes ordered the destruction of the temples on the Acropolis, a reprisal for the Greek burning of the temple of Cybele during the Ionian revolt that had originally provoked Darius's intervention. With Athens occupied, the Persian fleet moved to engage the combined Greek naval forces in the strait between the mainland and the island of Salamis, where the Athenian population had taken refuge. The ensuing Battle of Salamis would prove the turning point of the campaign, though few could have predicted it at the time. The Greek fleet, though outnumbered, enjoyed several advantages in the narrow confines of the strait. Their ships were more maneuverable, their crews more experienced in these particular waters, and their commanders unified under the leadership of the Athenian Themistocles, whose strategic foresight had prepared for just such a confrontation. The Persians, by contrast, entered the strait in some disorder. Their various contingents, Phoenician, Egyptian, Ionian, operating with less coordination than their opponents. As the sea battle raged beneath the hot September sun, Xerxes watched from a golden throne set up on the slopes of Mount Aigaleo. What he witnessed was the unraveling of Persian naval superiority. The heavier Persian ships, designed for ramming, found themselves unable to maneuver effectively in the confined space. Greek triremes darted between them, breaking oars and isolating individual enemy vessels. By day's end, perhaps 200 Persian ships had been sunk or captured, while Greek losses were minimal. Though the Persian land forces remained intact and Athens remained occupied, the naval defeat at Salamis created a strategic dilemma. Without naval supremacy, supplying the massive Persian army would become increasingly difficult as winter approached. After consulting with his commanders, Xerxes made the pragmatic decision to withdraw the bulk of his forces to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius with a still substantial army to continue operations in the following spring. Xerxes' return journey was less triumphant than his crossing had been. According to Herodotus, the pontoon bridges at the Hellespont had been damaged by storms, forcing parts of the army to cross by ship. Food shortages and disease further reduced the returning forces. Yet it's important to note that while the campaign had not achieved its maximal objectives, Xerxes could still claim significant successes. Northern Greece remained under Persian influence, Athens had been punished, and the empire's ability to project power across vast distances had been amply demonstrated. The following year, 479 BCE, saw the conclusion of this phase of the Greco-Persian Wars. The remaining Persian land forces under Mardonius were defeated at the Battle of Plataea, while on the same day, Greek forces destroyed the remnants of the Persian fleet at Mycale on the Ionian coast. These twin victories effectively ended the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece. For the Persian Empire, these setbacks, while significant, were hardly catastrophic. The vast resources of the imperial heartlands remained untouched, and most of the territories lost were peripheral to core Persian interests. Xerxes, returning to his capitals at Susa and Persepolis, turned his attention to extensive building projects, particularly the completion of the magnificent architectural complex at Persepolis, begun by his father. While the Persian retreat from Greece is often portrayed in Western historical tradition as a decisive defeat, contemporary Persian records tell a different story. In royal inscriptions, Xerxes continued to style himself as the King of Kings, ruler of lands from the Indus to the Aegean, from the steppes to the cataracts of the Nile. If the Greek campaign was considered a setback, it was not one that fundamentally challenged Persian imperial self-conception. The decades following the Greek campaign were a time of relative stability and prosperity for the empire. The administrative systems established by Darius continued to function effectively. Trade flourished along the royal roads, and the imperial capitals grew ever more magnificent. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, subtle changes were occurring. Shifts in the court atmosphere, in the relationship between the king and the nobility, in the balance of power between central authority and provincial governors. Xerxes himself would not live to see the longer-term consequences of these shifts. In 465 BCE, he fell victim to a palace conspiracy, assassinated in his bedchamber by his own bodyguard commander Artabanus, who was himself killed shortly thereafter in the ensuing power struggle. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, emerged victorious from this brief period of instability, securing the throne and initiating what would be a 40-year reign. Under Artaxerxes I, Persian policy toward Greece evolved from confrontation to more subtle influence. Rather than direct military intervention, the empire employed its vast wealth to support favorable factions within Greek cities, exploiting the chronic intercity rivalries that prevented Greek unity. This approach proved effective. Within decades, Sparta and Athens would be engaged in the destructive Peloponnesian War, with Persia providing financial support, first to one side, then the other, ensuring neither became too powerful. On the empire's eastern frontiers, Artaxerxes maintained the boundaries established by his predecessors, with the Indus River marking the limits of direct Persian control. Beyond lay the kingdoms of northern India, with whom the Persians maintained diplomatic and trade relations, but made no sustained efforts at conquest. To the northeast, the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes remained both trading partners and potential threats, requiring careful diplomatic management. In Egypt, always a potential flashpoint due to its strong sense of national identity and history of independence, Artaxerxes faced a significant rebellion led by a Libyan prince named Inaros beginning in 460 BCE. The rebels, supported by Athenian forces hoping to weaken Persia, initially achieved substantial successes, controlling much of the Delta region. After nearly 6 years of conflict, Persian forces under the satrap Megabyzus finally suppressed the revolt, re-establishing imperial control over this crucial province. This Egyptian campaign highlights an emerging pattern in imperial military operations during this period. Rather than the king personally leading massive expeditionary forces, as in Xerxes' day, military responsibilities were increasingly delegated to satraps and generals. This trend reflected both the maturing of the imperial administrative system and a shift in the nature of the monarchy itself, with kings becoming more remote figures, surrounded by elaborate court ceremonial. As the night deepens around us and the stars continue their eternal dance overhead, we see the Persian Empire in a moment of outward vigor, masking subtle transformations. The magnificent palaces at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana still gleam in the sunlight, their columns soaring toward the sky. The royal roads still carry messengers and trade goods across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The satrapies still remit their taxes to the central treasuries, funding the lavish court lifestyle and monumental building projects. Yet changes are underway beneath this impressive surface. The nobility, particularly the extended royal family, who control key satrapies and military commands, are accumulating greater autonomy. The king, increasingly secluded behind layers of court protocol, relies more heavily on eunuch administrators and personal favorites, creating tensions with the traditional Persian aristocracy. The seeds of future instability are being sown, though they will take decades to fully germinate. For now, as Artaxerxes I guides the empire with steady if unspectacular leadership, the Pax Persica, the Persian peace, continues to provide a framework for relative stability across much of the ancient Near East. Trade flourishes, cultural exchange enriches the lives of diverse peoples, and the administrative machinery established by Darius still functions with impressive efficiency. As your consciousness begins to drift toward the realm of dreams, envision once more the vast expanse of the Persian Empire at this moment of mature achievement. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, from the Caucasus to the first cataract of the Nile, diverse peoples live under the umbrella of Persian governance, maintaining their local traditions while participating in a larger economic and political system that transcends ethnic and religious boundaries. The wars of expansion have largely given way to the challenges of maintaining this vast inheritance, challenges that will grow more complex as new generations of rulers face evolving threats from both without and within. But those developments await us in our next chapter, as we continue to follow the golden thread of Persian history through the tapestry of time. Chapter 5: Xerxes and the Persian-Greek Wars. As the gentle curtain of night enfolds us once more, let us delve deeper into the pivotal era of Xerxes and the momentous confrontation between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, an epoch where two fundamentally different worldviews collided on the stage of history. Having inherited the vast empire constructed by his predecessors, Xerxes embodied the Persian ideal of kingship. Tall and imposing, adorned with the regalia of his office, the pleated purple robe, the upright tiara, golden jewelry signifying his status, he presented himself as the legitimate ruler of a universal state, the king of kings whose authority flowed from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrian tradition. Court etiquette reflected this exalted status. Those approaching the king were required to perform proskynesis, a gesture of respect that, depending on one's rank, might involve a simple bow, kneeling, or full prostration. To the Greeks, who would later witness and record these practices, such ceremonies seemed extravagant and demeaning. To the Persians, they were the natural expression of a cosmic order in which the great king stood as the living embodiment of divine will on earth. This cultural difference points to the deeper contrast between Persian and Greek worldviews that would shape their historic confrontation. The Persian imperial model emphasized universal authority, with diverse peoples united under a single ruler who respected local customs while demanding loyalty and tribute. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens, were developing a radically different model based on citizenship participation, though limited to free adult males, and fierce independence. When Xerxes looked westward toward Greece in the early years of his reign, he saw not a collection of freedom-loving democracies, as later Western tradition would frame them, but a disorderly frontier region whose chronic instability threatened the Persian concept of universal order. The expedition he planned was, in Persian eyes, merely the logical extension of imperial authority into territories that properly belonged within the empire's sphere. Let us now revisit the dramatic events of 480 to 479 BCE with a more balanced perspective than the purely Greek viewpoint that has dominated Western historical memory. As we've seen, Xerxes' expedition was a masterpiece of logistical planning. The construction of the pontoon bridges across the Hellespont and the canal through the Athos Peninsula demonstrated Persian engineering prowess. The assembly of forces from across the imperial domains showcased the empire's organizational capacity. Imagine the spectacle as this vast host made its way along the northern Aegean coast in the spring and early summer of 480 BCE. At night, thousands of campfires would have dotted the landscape, their glow visible for miles. By day, the glint of sunlight on bronze helmets and spear points created a moving river of metal. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of so many marching feet, while local streams ran dry as countless vessels were filled to slake the thirst of men and animals alike. For the Greek city-states facing this existential threat, the crisis forced an unprecedented level of cooperation, though significant divisions remained. Athens and Sparta emerged as the leaders of resistance, yet even they disagreed fundamentally on strategy. The Spartans, as a primarily land power, favored establishing defensive positions at narrow passes like Thermopylae. The Athenians, having invested heavily in naval power following the discovery of silver deposits at Laurium, insisted that control of the sea would determine the ultimate outcome. The initial encounters at Thermopylae and Artemisium in August 480 BCE unfolded as we've previously described. A temporary Greek success on land negated by Persian discovery of the flanking path, simultaneous naval engagements ending inconclusively before the Greek fleet withdrew upon learning of the land defeat. These battles, though often romanticized in Western tradition, were essentially delaying actions that gained time for the more decisive confrontation to come. The evacuation of Athens represented both a strategic necessity and a remarkable act of social cohesion. Based on the prophetic advice of the Delphic oracle to trust in the wooden walls, interpreted by Themistocles to mean the navy, the Athenians abandoned their city and relocated their entire population to the island of Salamis and other locations. Women, children, the elderly, all were moved in an operation without precedent in Greek history. Only a small group of priests and priestesses remained to tend sacred sites, along with others who refused to leave. When Persian forces entered the abandoned city in September, they found only token resistance. The symbolic destruction of temples on the Acropolis provided Xerxes with the satisfaction of having punished the Athenians for their support of the Ionian revolt and their victory at Marathon a decade earlier. Yet this physical occupation, while impressive as a demonstration of Persian power projection, did not resolve the strategic situation as long as the Greek fleet remained intact. The ensuing naval battle in the Straits of Salamis would prove decisive in ways that neither side fully anticipated. The confined waters played to Greek advantages in ship design and crew training, while negating Persian numerical superiority. Greek triremes, lighter and more maneuverable, could execute the diek plus, a tactic of rowing through gaps in the enemy line, then turning to ram the vulnerable sides of ships or shear off their banks of oars. As the battle raged from morning into afternoon, the sea became littered with broken ships and struggling swimmers. According to Herodotus, Persian crews who could not swim faced almost certain death if thrown into the water, while many Greeks raised in a maritime culture could make their way to shore. By day's end, as the golden light of sunset illuminated the carnage, the Persian fleet had suffered significant losses, while Greek naval power remained largely intact. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to Xerxes and his advisors. Without naval supremacy, maintaining supply lines for the massive Persian land army would become increasingly difficult as winter approached. Rather than risk having his forces trapped in hostile territory with tenuous supply, Xerxes chose the path of prudent leadership, a strategic withdrawal with the bulk of his forces, leaving his general Mardonius with a still substantial army to continue operations from bases in friendly Thessaly. In making this decision, Xerxes demonstrated the pragmatism that characterized Persian imperial governance at its best. Unlike rulers who might sacrifice armies out of pride or stubbornness, he recognized that the empire's strength lay in its ability to sustain operations over the long term, to adjust strategies in the face of setbacks, and to leverage its vast resources toward achievable objectives. The king's journey back to Asia was less triumphant than his crossing had been, with Herodotus claiming that the army suffered from food shortages and disease along the way. Yet the core of the Persian force remained intact, and most of northern Greece remained under Persian influence. From an imperial perspective, while the campaign had not achieved maximum success, neither was it the unmitigated disaster that Greek sources would later portray. The following spring brought the final acts of this phase of the Greco-Persian Wars. At Plataea in August 479 BCE, the remaining Persian land forces under Mardonius faced a combined Greek army led by the Spartan regent Pausanias. After days of maneuver and skirmishing, a full-scale battle developed when the Persian cavalry disrupted Greek supply lines. Despite initial Persian success against the Greek left wing, the disciplined Spartan hoplites on the right ultimately proved decisive, breaking through the Persian infantry lines and killing Mardonius himself. With their commander dead and their formation broken, Persian forces retreated in increasing disorder. The Greek victory was comprehensive, ending the immediate Persian military presence in mainland Greece. On the same day, according to Greek tradition, though modern historians question the exact timing, a Greek fleet destroyed Persian naval forces at Mycale on the Ionian coast, encouraging rebellions in Persian-controlled Greek cities throughout Ionia. These twin defeats marked not the collapse of Persian imperial power, but rather the establishment of its effective limits. Greece would remain outside direct Persian control, though Persian influence through diplomatic channels and financial leverage would continue to shape Greek politics for decades to come. For the empire as a whole, the setback was significant, but hardly catastrophic, a recalibration of strategic goals rather than an existential crisis. Returning to his capitals at Susa and Persepolis, Xerxes turned his attention to internal affairs and building projects, particularly the completion and expansion of the magnificent complex at Persepolis begun by his father. The Apadana, audience hall, was finished, its roof supported by 72 columns, each 72 feet tall. The hall of 100 columns provided additional ceremonial space, while Xerxes's own palace incorporated the latest refinements in Persian architectural aesthetics. These construction activities reflected not just personal glorification, but the Persian imperial ideology itself. The creation of spaces that physically embodied the concept of universal kingship through their scale, artistry, and iconography. Relief sculptures showing representatives of all nations bringing tribute, or the king enthroned receiving homage, made visible the imperial ideal of diverse peoples united under benevolent but absolute authority. Despite these impressive achievements, subtle shifts were occurring in the nature of the Persian monarchy during Xerxes's later years. The king became increasingly remote, surrounded by layers of court ceremonial and reliant on a small circle of trusted advisors, many of them eunuchs whose loyalty was personal rather than tied to noble family interests. This growing seclusion, while increasing the king's mystique, distanced him from the traditional Persian aristocracy and military leadership that had formed the backbone of the empire's rise to power. These trends contributed to the circumstances of Xerxes' death in 465 BCE. After a reign of 21 years, he fell victim to a palace conspiracy led by Artabanus, the commander of his bodyguard, possibly with the collusion of his own son, Artaxerxes. According to the Greek historian Ctesias, whose account, though often unreliable, contains elements likely based on Persian court gossip, Artabanus murdered Xerxes in his bedchamber, then framed the king's eldest son, Darius, for the crime. This led to Darius's execution before Artabanus himself was killed, either by the surviving son Artaxerxes upon discovering the plot or in a subsequent power struggle. Whatever the exact circumstances, this violent transition marked the beginning of a pattern that would recur throughout later Persian history. Succession crises and court intrigues that temporarily weakened central authority without fundamentally threatening the imperial structure. The administrative systems established by Darius were sufficiently robust to weather such periods of instability, allowing the empire to maintain its essential coherence even when leadership at the top was contested. Artaxerxes I, emerging victorious from this brief period of turmoil, would rule for the next 40 years, presiding over what some historians consider the Indian summer of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a time of relative stability and prosperity, though lacking the dynamic expansion of earlier periods. His reign saw a shift in Persian policy toward Greece, from direct military confrontation to more subtle diplomatic and financial influence, playing Greek city-states against one another to ensure none became powerful enough to threaten Persian interests. This period also witnessed significant internal developments that would have long-term implications for Persian imperial governance. The nobility, particularly those controlling key satrapies, gradually accumulated greater autonomy from central control. The satrapal revolts that occurred intermittently throughout Artaxerxes' reign, while individually manageable, indicated structural tensions within the imperial system, the perennial challenge of balancing local authority necessary for effective governance of distant territories against the centrifugal tendencies inherent in such arrangements. Another subtle but important shift concerned the relationship between the monarchy and the Zoroastrian priesthood. While Persian kings from Darius onward had identified themselves as worshippers of Ahura Mazda, they had maintained the traditional Persian policy of religious tolerance throughout the empire. Under Artaxerxes I, the Zoroastrian priesthood began to exercise greater influence at court, gradually moving toward a more formal state religion that would eventually affect imperial policy toward local religious practices in the provinces. As night deepens around us and the constellations wheel slowly overhead, we pause to consider the Persian Empire at this crucial juncture in its history. The failures of Xerxes' Greek campaign, while significant in Western historical memory, did not fundamentally alter the empire's trajectory. Persia remained the predominant power in the Near East, its wealth, military capacity, and administrative sophistication unmatched by any contemporary state. Yet subtle changes were underway beneath this impressive surface, shifts in the court atmosphere, in the relationship between king and nobility, in the balance between central authority and provincial autonomy. These changes, barely perceptible in the moment, would gradually reshape the character of Persian imperial governance over subsequent generations, creating both new vulnerabilities and new adaptations as the empire faced evolving challenges from within and without. As your consciousness begins to drift toward the realm of dreams, envision once more the magnificent terraces of Persepolis, where Xerxes completed his father's vision of a ceremonial capital that would awe visitors with its scale and artistry. See the king seated on his golden throne in the Apadana, receiving homage from representatives of the many nations under his rule. Though the Greek adventure had not achieved its maximal objectives, the Persian peace, the Pax Persica, still encompassed the majority of the civilized world as then known, providing a framework for trade, cultural exchange, and relative stability across vast and diverse territories. The confrontation between Persia and Greece, destined to occupy an outsized place in Western historical consciousness, represents just one chapter in the longer story of an empire whose contributions to governance, art, architecture, and religious thought would influence civilizations far beyond its temporal and geographic boundaries. As we continue our journey through the Persian imperial epic, we will witness both the challenges of maintaining this vast inheritance and the enduring legacy that would outlive the empire itself. Chapter 6: Artaxerxes and a Time of Intrigue. As the stars continue their nightly procession across the velvet canvas of the sky, we turn another page in our chronicle of the Persian Empire. With the ascension of Artaxerxes I, following the turbulent transition after Xerxes' assassination, the empire entered a period of subtle but significant transformation, a time when palace intrigues and provincial unrest began to reveal the inherent challenges of maintaining such a vast and diverse realm. Artaxerxes I, whose name means righteous kingdom, came to power in 465 BCE under circumstances shadowed by violence and conspiracy. Whether he was complicit in his father's murder, as some ancient sources suggest, or merely the fortunate survivor of court machinations beyond his control, the young king faced immediate challenges to his authority. His long reign, extending until 424 BCE, would be characterized less by dramatic conquests than by the patient management of imperial resources and the delicate balancing of competing factions within the imperial system. Picture Artaxerxes in the early years of his reign, seated on the golden throne in the audience hall at Susa. Now in his 20s, he had been raised in the rarefied atmosphere of the Persian court, educated in the principles of governance, military leadership, and the ethical precepts of Zoroastrianism. Around him gathered the power brokers of the empire, noble Persian families whose support was essential, eunuch administrators who managed the daily operations of the imperial household, military commanders responsible for the security of the realm, and ambassadors from distant provinces and foreign powers awaiting royal attention. The empire Artaxerxes inherited remained impressive in its scale and organization. From the Indus to the Aegean, from the Caucasus to the first cataract of the Nile, diverse peoples lived under Persian overlordship, paying taxes to the imperial treasury and recognizing the great king as the ultimate authority. The administrative systems established by Darius I still functioned effectively, with satraps governing provinces, royal inspectors monitoring their activities, and a communication network allowing for relatively rapid transmission of orders and information across vast distances. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, structural tensions were becoming increasingly evident. The very success of the Persian imperial model had created new challenges. Wealthy satraps in distant provinces, often members of the royal family or high nobility, accumulated power bases that could potentially rival central authority. The growing sophistication of court life, with its elaborate ceremonies and protocols, widened the gap between the monarch and the traditional Persian aristocracy, whose support had been crucial to the empire's formation. One of the first crises Artaxerxes faced emerged in Egypt, that ancient land whose strong sense of national identity and historical independence made it particularly resistant to foreign rule. In 460 BCE, a Libyan prince named Inaros, leading a coalition of Egyptian nationalists and Libyan allies, seized control of much of the Delta region and declared independence from Persian oversight. The rebellion gained international dimensions when Athens, seeing an opportunity to strike at Persian power, sent a substantial fleet to support the Egyptian rebels. For nearly 6 years, this conflict raged across the fertile Nile Delta. Initial rebel successes, including the defeat and death of the Persian satrap Achaemenes, Artaxerxes' uncle, suggested the potential for a significant reduction of Persian power in the eastern Mediterranean. However, the great king responded with characteristic Persian thoroughness, dispatching a large force under the experienced commander Megabyzus. After a series of difficult campaigns, including an 18-month siege of rebel strongholds in the Delta marshes, Persian authority was fully restored by 454 BCE. The Egyptian rebellion, while ultimately suppressed, revealed several important developments in the imperial system. The length and difficulty of the conflict demonstrated the challenges of maintaining control over culturally distinct territories at the empire's periphery. The Athenian intervention represented an evolution in Greek strategy from defensive resistance to opportunistic attacks on Persian interests. Perhaps most significantly, the prominent role played by Megabyzus, a nobleman from one of Persia's most distinguished families, illustrated the growing importance of powerful individuals within the imperial power structure. Indeed, the aftermath of the Egyptian campaign would reveal the potential tensions inherent in this reliance on powerful nobles. Megabyzus, returning victorious, found himself at odds with Artaxerxes over the treatment of Egyptian prisoners who had been granted terms of surrender. When the king violated these terms, Megabyzus felt his personal honor compromised and retired to his satrapy of Syria, where he eventually raised a rebellion against royal authority. Though this conflict was ultimately resolved through negotiation rather than force, with Megabyzus reconciled to the king and restored to favor, it demonstrated how personal and familial interests could sometimes diverge from those of the monarchy, creating fault lines within the imperial structure. Similar challenges emerged in other regions. In Asia Minor, various Greek cities under Persian control occasionally rebelled, often with support from Athens or other mainland Greek powers. In the northeast, nomadic peoples beyond the imperial frontiers required constant vigilance. Even in the imperial core territories, ambitious nobles and rival branches of the extended royal family engaged in constant competition for influence and position. Artaxerxes' approach to these challenges demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Persian imperial model in this mature phase. Rather than leading military campaigns personally, as his predecessors often had, he increasingly delegated operational authority to trusted commanders. Rather than imposing direct Persian control everywhere, he leveraged the empire's vast wealth to influence events through subsidies, bribes, and strategic marriages. When force was necessary, it was applied precisely and efficiently. But the preferred tools of imperial management were diplomatic engagement and the careful balancing of competing interests. This evolution toward a more diplomatically focused imperial style is perhaps best illustrated by Persian policy toward the Greek world during this period. Following the defeats at Plataea and Mycale, direct military confrontation had given way to more subtle influence. The Peace of Callias, negotiated around 449 BCE, though some historians question whether this was a formal treaty or merely a tacit understanding, established spheres of influence between the Persian Empire and the Athenian-led Delian League. Under its terms, Persia recognized Athenian hegemony over Greek cities in Europe and the islands, while Athens acknowledged Persian control over Greek cities in Asia Minor. Persian ships would not sail west of specific boundary points in the eastern Mediterranean, while Athens pledged not to intervene in territories under Persian authority. This pragmatic accommodation allowed both powers to secure their essential interests without the constant drain of open warfare. Yet Persian diplomacy extended beyond mere boundary arrangements. As tensions between Athens and Sparta grew in the decades following the Persian Wars, eventually erupting into the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, Persian policy adapted opportunistically. Artaxerxes and his successors provided financial support first to one Greek power, then another, ensuring that no single city-state became dominant in the region. When Athens seemed ascendant, Persian gold flowed to Sparta. When Spartan power threatened to become excessive, subsidies shifted to Athens or other states like Thebes. This strategy of maintaining balance among potential rivals would become a hallmark of Persian diplomacy, minimizing direct military involvement while protecting imperial interests. Within the royal court itself, this period saw the growing influence of the women of the royal household, particularly the queen mother and the king's principal wife. Amestris, widow of Xerxes and mother of Artaxerxes, wielded significant behind-the-scenes power, especially in matters of court appointments and dynastic marriages. Though largely invisible in official records, these royal women maintained extensive networks of influence, controlling substantial personal wealth and often serving as conduits for petitions to the king from those outside the formal power structure. The eunuch administrators who managed the daily operations of the royal household also gained prominence during this period. Neither fully male in the cultural understanding of the time, nor female, these individuals occupied a unique social space that allowed them to move between the male world of political power and the female world of the royal harem. Their loyalty was personal rather than familial or tribal, making them valuable agents for kings seeking to counterbalance the influence of the hereditary nobility. Artaxerxes relied heavily on such figures, most notably his chief steward Artaxerxes, who became one of the most powerful individuals in the empire. This growing complexity of court life was reflected in the increasingly elaborate ceremonial surrounding the monarch. The king now rarely appeared in public, and audiences followed rigid protocols governing everything from the distance at which different ranks stood from the royal presence to the precise gestures of obeisance required. These ceremonies reinforced the king's semi-divine status, while also insulating him from direct contact with all but his closest advisers, a development that brought both political advantages and potential dangers in terms of access to unfiltered information. Despite these evolving internal dynamics, the fundamental structures of imperial governance remained remarkably stable during Artaxerxes' long reign. The satrapies continued to remit their assigned tributes. The royal roads facilitated trade and communication across vast distances, and the diverse peoples of the empire generally accepted Persian overlordship as legitimate, if not always enthusiastically embraced. Indeed, for most inhabitants of the empire, life under Persian rule brought significant benefits. Regional peace allowed for agricultural development and commerce to flourish. The Persian policy of religious tolerance meant local faiths continued undisturbed, often receiving imperial patronage. Imperial investments in infrastructure, irrigation systems, roads, bridges, improved material conditions in many regions. For merchants, the common standards of weights, measures, and coinage facilitated trade across previously fragmented markets. Yet this mature imperial system also faced characteristic challenges of middle age. Innovation slowed as established practices became routine. The nobility, growing accustomed to luxury, began to lose some of the martial vigor that had characterized earlier generations. Tax revenues, while still substantial, faced increasing pressure from the growing costs of maintaining the elaborate court, the standing military forces, and the extensive administrative apparatus. As Artaxerxes aged, the question of succession took on increasing urgency. Unlike the clear transition planned by Darius for Xerxes, the later years of Artaxerxes' reign saw increasing competition among potential heirs. His eldest legitimate son, Xerxes II, was positioned as the official successor, but half-brothers from other royal wives maneuvered for advantage, building alliances with noble families and court officials who might support their claims. When Artaxerxes finally died in 424 BCE after a 40-year reign, the succession proved as troubled as these circumstances might suggest. Xerxes II took the throne, but survived only 45 days before being assassinated by his half-brother Sogdianus, who himself was overthrown after 6 months by another half-brother, Ochus, who took the throne name Darius II. This period of instability, though brief, revealed the growing vulnerability of the imperial system to palace intrigues and succession disputes. Unlike earlier transitions where institutional strength had maintained stability despite leadership changes, The complex web of court factions now threatened to undermine imperial coherence during moments of transition. Darius II, having secured the throne through violence, faced immediate challenges to his authority. Several satraps, sensing opportunity in the confused central situation, moved toward greater autonomy or outright rebellion. The most significant of these challenges came from Arsaces, another of Artaxerxes' sons, who raised a substantial revolt with support from a prominent general named Artephius. Though Darius eventually suppressed these rebellions, often through bribery as much as military action, they indicated the fragility of central control when imperial leadership appeared weak or divided. During his 19-year reign, 423 to 404 BCE, Darius II increasingly delegated authority to his wife Parysatis, an intelligent and ruthlessly ambitious woman who effectively managed court affairs while the king focused on maintaining his position and indulging in the luxuries of royal life. Together, they groomed their eldest son, Arsaces, the future Artaxerxes II, for succession, while their younger son, Cyrus, later known as Cyrus the Younger, received special attention from his mother, who preferred his more dynamic personality. The most significant external development during Darius II's reign was the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War, where Persian financial support proved decisive in the Spartan victory over Athens. By providing funds for Sparta to build a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval supremacy, Persia helped end Athens' maritime empire that had long been a thorn in the side of Persian interests in the eastern Mediterranean. The subsequent King's Peace, also known as the Peace of Antalcidas, formally recognized Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, a diplomatic triumph that restored territories lost nearly a century earlier. When Darius II died in 404 BCE, the succession initially appeared straightforward, with Arsaces taking the throne as Artaxerxes II. However, his younger brother Cyrus, who had been appointed as the powerful satrap of Lydia and other western provinces, soon began plotting to seize the crown. With financial resources from his rich provinces, Cyrus assembled an army that included 10,000 Greek mercenaries, the famous 10,000 later immortalized in Xenophon's Anabasis, and marched against his brother. The brothers' armies met at Cunaxa near Babylon in 401 BCE. Though Cyrus's forces initially gained the upper hand and the prince himself nearly killed Artaxerxes in direct combat, Cyrus was killed by a javelin thrown by a common soldier. Without their leader, his cause collapsed, though the Greek mercenaries, finding themselves stranded deep in hostile territory, managed a remarkable fighting retreat back to the Black Sea coast, an epic journey that would become one of the most famous military exploits in ancient literature. The defeat of Cyrus's rebellion consolidated Artaxerxes II's position, beginning what would be the longest reign of any Achaemenid king, 404 to 358 BCE. Yet this period would also see the acceleration of trends that gradually undermined imperial cohesion. Satrapal revolts became more frequent, with the western satrapies particularly prone to assertions of autonomy. Egypt successfully broke away in 404 BCE under native leadership, remaining independent for 60 years, despite repeated Persian attempts at reconquest. Within the court, faction fighting intensified, with Queen Mother Parysatis continuing to wield enormous influence, often working to undermine officials she viewed as enemies of her favorites. The king himself, though not unintelligent, lacked the forceful personality of the dynasty's founders. Increasingly, real power lay with a small circle of advisors, influential royal women, and the commanders of the royal guard who controlled physical access to the monarch. This period also saw significant religious developments that would have long-term cultural implications. While early Persian kings had identified themselves as worshippers of Ahura Mazda, while maintaining the traditional Persian policy of religious tolerance, Artaxerxes II undertook a significant religious innovation. He actively promoted the cult of Anahita, a goddess associated with waters and fertility, and Mithra, a deity of covenants and oaths, elevating them to positions alongside Ahura Mazda in official inscriptions. This development suggests both a move toward a more structured pantheon and possibly an attempt to incorporate popular religious practices into the official imperial cult. As Artaxerxes II aged, the familiar pattern of succession intrigue re-emerged. His eldest son, Darius, was designated as official heir, but was executed after being implicated in a plot against the king. Another son, Ariaspes, committed suicide after being manipulated by his brother Ochus into believing he had fallen from royal favor. When Artaxerxes finally died in 358 BCE, the path was clear for Ochus to take the throne as Artaxerxes III, another succession secured through family blood. The reign of Artaxerxes III, 358 to 338 BCE, represented both the last significant revival of Persian imperial power and a brutal intensification of court politics. Intelligent and utterly ruthless, the new king began his reign by ordering the execution of all possible royal rivals, regardless of age or threat level. He then turned his considerable energy and ability to the empire's most pressing external challenge, the reconquest of Egypt, which had maintained its independence for 6 decades, despite several Persian attempts to restore control. After a failed expedition early in his reign, Artaxerxes III personally led a massive campaign in 343 BCE that finally succeeded in bringing Egypt back into the imperial fold. This victory, following so many previous failures, temporarily reversed the impression of imperial decline and demonstrated that the empire could still mobilize substantial resources when led by a determined monarch. Yet even this revival proved short-lived. In 338 BCE, the king and most of his sons were poisoned by the eunuch Bagoas, the powerful chief minister who had come to control palace appointments. Bagoas placed Artaxerxes III's youngest son on the throne as Arses, intending to rule through him as a puppet king. When Arses showed signs of independent action after 2 years, Bagoas had him poisoned as well. Running short of royal candidates willing to serve as figurehead, Bagoas turned to a distant cousin of the royal house named Darius, who took the throne as Darius III in 336 BCE. However, this new king proved less pliable than anticipated. Soon after his accession, he eliminated Bagoas, freeing himself from the kingmaker's control, but also removing the experienced administrator who had managed the complex imperial system during the recent turbulent years. As these palace intrigues played out in the imperial capitals, a new threat was emerging in the west that would soon challenge the very existence of the Persian Empire. In Macedonia, a frontier kingdom at the northern edge of the Greek world, King Philip II had transformed a once marginal state into the dominant power in Greece through military innovation, shrewd diplomacy, and the systematic exploitation of gold and silver mines. Following Philip's assassination in 336 BCE, his son Alexander ascended the Macedonian throne, inheriting both his father's formidable military machine and his planned expedition against Persia. The young Macedonian king, not yet the Great, invaded Persian territory in 334 BCE, crossing the Hellespont with an army of approximately 40,000 men. Though significantly smaller than the forces the Persian Empire could potentially mobilize, Alexander's army was professional, cohesive, and led by experienced commanders loyal to their king. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissa spears, provided a formidable infantry base, while heavy cavalry could deliver decisive shock action at critical moments. Against this focused threat, Darius III found himself hampered by the structural weaknesses that had developed in the imperial system over generations. Though not lacking in personal courage, he had limited military experience and had not expected to become king. The satraps of the western provinces, accustomed to significant autonomy, coordinated poorly in responding to the invasion. The Persian cavalry remained excellent, but infantry quality had declined as the empire increasingly relied on mercenaries rather than citizen levies for this arm. The first major confrontation came at the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia, where Persian forces attempted to prevent Alexander's advance. The battle ended in Macedonian victory, opening the western satrapies to Alexander's advance. One by one, the great cities of Asia Minor, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus, fell to the invader or surrendered without resistance. By autumn 333 BCE, Alexander had reached Issus in southeastern Anatolia, where Darius himself had arrived with the main Persian army. Though the Persian force was numerically superior, the confined coastal terrain negated this advantage. In the ensuing battle, Alexander's bold cavalry charge, directly at Darius's position in the center, broke the Persian line. Darius, fearing capture, fled the field, leaving behind his camp, his treasury, and even his family members, who were taken captive by Alexander. Following this victory, Alexander chose not to pursue Darius immediately, but instead turned south toward Egypt, systematically securing the eastern Mediterranean coastline to prevent Persian naval forces from threatening his rear. After the extended sieges of Tyre and Gaza, Alexander entered Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. The priests of Amun at the Siwa oasis proclaimed him son of Amun, identified with Alexander's claimed ancestor Zeus, providing divine sanction for his conquest in Egyptian terms. Meanwhile, Darius retreated to the imperial heartlands, gathering forces for a decisive confrontation. By summer 331 BCE, he had assembled a massive army on the plains of northern Mesopotamia, selecting the battlefield at Gaugamela for its flat terrain that would allow his superior numbers and cavalry to maneuver effectively. The force included contingents from across the empire: Bactrian horsemen, Indian chariots, Persian immortals, Scythian horse archers, representing the full ethnic diversity that had been the empire's strength. In early October 331 BCE, the armies met on the dusty plain. Despite careful Persian preparations, including leveling the ground and setting caltrops to disrupt cavalry charges, Alexander's tactical genius again proved decisive. Anticipating that Darius would try to envelop his numerically inferior force, Alexander deployed his army in a refused flank formation, drawing the Persian left wing forward before launching a cavalry charge through a gap that opened in the Persian line. Once again, Alexander drove directly for Darius himself, and once again, the great king fled rather than risk capture or death. This time, the defeat proved fatal to the Persian imperial structure. With the royal army scattered and the king in flight, resistance collapsed across the central provinces. Alexander entered Babylon without opposition, the ancient city's governor calculating that graceful submission would preserve his position under the new regime. Similar welcomes awaited the conqueror at Susa and Persepolis, the Persian capitals, where the accumulated treasure of centuries filled the royal storehouses. At Persepolis, in a moment laden with symbolic significance, Alexander ordered the burning of the palace complex after a night of drunken celebration. Whether this was a calculated act of retribution for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier, as some ancient sources suggest, or merely a drunken accident, the flames that consumed the magnificent ceremonial capital represented the effective end of Achaemenid Persian rule. The administrative systems established by Darius the Great, the court protocols developed over generations, the careful balance of central authority and local autonomy, all were swept away in the conflagration of conquest. Darius III, fleeing eastward toward his remaining forces in Bactria, was detained by the satrap Bessus, who apparently calculated that delivering the king to Alexander might win favorable treatment. When Alexander's forces drew near, Bessus and his fellow conspirators mortally wounded Darius and left him dying by the roadside, where a Macedonian scout discovered him. According to the romantic tradition preserved by later historians, the great king expired just as Alexander himself arrived, allowing the conqueror to show respect to his fallen adversary by covering the body with his own cloak. With Darius's death in July 330 BCE, the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled the Persian Empire for over 2 centuries came to its end. Though Bessus briefly claimed the throne as Artaxerxes V in the eastern provinces, his support quickly eroded as Alexander's forces advanced into Central Asia. By 327 BCE, all organized resistance had ceased, and the entire Persian Empire had passed under Macedonian control. As we pause in our narrative journey, the night sky above us filled with the same eternal stars that witnessed these momentous events, we reflect on the swift and dramatic collapse of what had been the ancient world's greatest imperial structure. How could an empire that had withstood challenges for over 2 centuries fall so rapidly to a relatively small invading force? The answer lies partly in the cumulative effect of the trends we have traced through the century before Alexander's invasion. the growing autonomy of satraps that undermined coordinated response, the increasingly deadly court intrigues that eliminated capable leaders and created succession instability, the gradual military decline as Persian elites grew accustomed to luxury rather than the harder virtues of their ancestors. Yet Alexander's own exceptional qualities as a leader must also be acknowledged. Combining tactical brilliance, personal courage that inspired his troops, and psychological insight into his adversaries' weaknesses, the young Macedonian king systematically dismantled Persian resistance. Moreover, his willingness to adopt elements of Persian governance and court ceremonial, presenting himself as a legitimate successor to Darius rather than merely a conqueror, eased the transition for many Persian elites who simply transferred their loyalty to the new ruler. As your eyelids grow heavy and sleep begins to beckon, imagine once more the magnificent panorama of the Persian Empire at its height, the royal road stretching from Sardis to Susa, the diverse peoples united under the King of Kings, the administrative systems that maintained imperial coherence across vast distances. This remarkable achievement, though ultimately overcome by the vicissitudes of history, would leave an indelible mark on the development of later imperial systems and on the cultural heritage of the lands that once formed its domain. The golden thread of Persian influence would continue to weave through the tapestry of history long after Alexander's conquest, a legacy we shall explore in our final chapter as we consider the echoes of Persia that continue to resonate through the corridors of time. Chapter 7. Alexander the Great's Conquest. The night deepens around us as we turn to the final dramatic act in the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, its confrontation with Alexander of Macedon, whose meteoric career would transform the ancient world and bring the 2-century reign of the Persian kings of kings to its conclusion. To understand this momentous collision, we must first glimpse the world from which Alexander emerged. Macedonia, a rugged kingdom on the northern frontiers of the Greek world, had long been considered semi-barbaric by the more sophisticated city-states to the south. Its people spoke a Greek dialect, but maintained distinct tribal customs, and its monarchy, unlike the democratic or oligarchic systems of southern Greece, exercised direct and often personal authority. Under King Philip II, Alexander's father, Macedonia had undergone a remarkable transformation. Ascending to the throne of a weak and threatened state in 359 BCE, Philip systematically rebuilt Macedonian power through military innovation, diplomatic cunning, and the exploitation of newly developed gold mines that funded his ambitions. The creation of the Macedonian phalanx, a densely packed infantry formation armed with sarissas, spears up to 18 feet long, gave his armies a formidable base, while reforms in cavalry tactics and siege warfare rounded out a comprehensive military system. By 338 BCE, Philip had defeated a coalition of southern Greek states at the Battle of Chaeronea, effectively bringing all of mainland Greece under Macedonian hegemony. With the Greek world united, if reluctantly, behind him, Philip began preparations for an invasion of Persian territory in Asia Minor, both to secure Macedonia's eastern flank and to cast himself as the avenger of Persian invasions of Greece over a century earlier. But fate intervened. In summer 336 BCE, at the wedding celebration of his daughter, Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards. Though the immediate motivations remain debated by historians, the killing thrust Philip's son Alexander, then just 20 years old, onto the Macedonian throne at a moment of both opportunity and peril. Alexander moved decisively to secure his position, eliminating potential rivals and suppressing rebellions that broke out in southern Greece at news of Philip's death. By autumn, his authority in Europe was secure, allowing him to turn his attention to the Asian expedition his father had planned. In spring 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, modern Dardanelles, with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,500 cavalry. Though modest by Persian standards, this force represented the professional core of the Macedonian military system, supplemented by contingents from allied Greek states. More importantly, it was unified in purpose and leadership, with Alexander commanding the absolute loyalty of his men through a combination of personal charisma, shared hardship, and demonstrated mastery of the art of war. As Alexander's forces moved inland from the coast, they encountered the first significant Persian resistance at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor had assembled an army of roughly equal size to Alexander's, with particular strength in cavalry. Rejecting advice to retreat and adopt scorched earth tactics, the Persian commanders chose to make their stand on the river's eastern bank, believing the water barrier would disrupt the Macedonian attack. Alexander defied conventional wisdom by launching an immediate frontal assault across the river. The battle that followed was chaotic and bloody, with Alexander himself nearly killed in combat with Persian nobles. The decisive moment came when Alexander's companion cavalry punched through the Persian center, allowing the Macedonian infantry to establish a foothold beyond the river. With their line broken, the Persian forces retreated in disorder, leaving Asia Minor vulnerable to Macedonian advance. In the aftermath of this victory, Alexander adopted a policy that would characterize his entire campaign, presenting himself as a liberator rather than conqueror to Greek cities under Persian rule, while methodically securing his supply lines and neutralizing Persian naval bases that might threaten his rear. The great cities of Western Asia Minor fell one by one. Sardis, administrative center of the region, surrendered without resistance. Ephesus welcomed Alexander after the Persian garrison withdrew. Miletus and Halicarnassus required sieges, but eventually succumbed to Macedonian siege techniques. Meanwhile, in the imperial capitals of Susa and Persepolis, these events must have seemed distant and manageable, provincial skirmishes on the empire's western frontier, troublesome but hardly existential threats. Darius III, who had ascended to the Persian throne just 2 years before Alexander's invasion, initially delegated the response to local satraps, perhaps believing the young Macedonian king would be content with limited territorial gains, or could be bought off with diplomatic concessions. Only as Alexander continued methodically advancing eastward, rejecting Persian diplomatic overtures and securing his positions in Asia Minor, did the full dimensions of the threat become apparent to the Persian high command. By summer 333 BCE, Darius had mobilized the central imperial forces and was moving toward Syria to confront the invader personally. The armies met near the coastal city of Issus in a narrow plain between mountains and sea. Darius, having moved north more quickly than Alexander anticipated, had actually managed to cut the Macedonian supply lines. But Alexander, displaying the battlefield agility that repeatedly gave him advantage over the more numerous but less flexible Persian forces, turned his army to meet the threat. The Battle of Issus unfolded on terrain that limited the Persians' ability to leverage their superior numbers. Alexander, recognizing that Persian armies were typically commanded from the center by the king himself, focused his attack directly at Darius's position. Leading his companion cavalry in a charge that broke through the Persian lines, Alexander drove for the great king's chariot. As the Persian center collapsed under this pressure, Darius, fearing capture or death, fled the battlefield, triggering a general retreat. The Persian defeat at Issus had consequences beyond the immediate military situation. In their hasty retreat, the Persian royal family, Darius's mother, wife, and children, were left behind and captured by Alexander. While the Macedonian king treated these royal captives with marked respect, their presence in his camp served as a powerful symbol of Persian vulnerability. Moreover, the Persian military mystique, already damaged at Granicus, suffered another severe blow. If the great king himself could be put to flight, how could satraps or garrison commanders be expected to stand firm? Rather than pursuing Darius immediately into the empire's heartland, Alexander chose to secure the eastern Mediterranean coastline first, eliminating Persian naval bases that might threaten his logistics or communication with Macedonia. This decision led to the famous sieges of Tyre and Gaza, where Alexander's forces overcame formidable defenses through a combination of engineering ingenuity, dogged persistence, and occasional brutality. With the coastal regions secured, Alexander turned to Egypt, a land that had frequently rebelled against Persian rule and harbored strong resentment of Persian religious policies. The Persian satrap, recognizing the hopelessness of resistance given events further north, surrendered without a fight. Alexander was welcomed by the Egyptian priesthood as a liberator, and in a ceremony at the temple of Amun at Siwa Oasis was proclaimed son of Amun, interpreted by Greeks as recognition of his claimed descent from Zeus. This Egyptian interlude allowed Alexander time to consolidate his growing empire, while Darius gathered forces for a decisive confrontation. The Persian king, learning from the confined conditions at Issus that had negated his numerical advantage, selected the open plains of northern Mesopotamia for the battlefield. At Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq, he assembled an enormous force drawn from all parts of the empire, perhaps 100,000 men, including Bactrian cavalry, Indian chariots, Persian infantry, and contingents from dozens of subject peoples. To maximize his advantage in numbers and cavalry, Darius had the battlefield specially prepared, leveling the ground and removing obstacles that might disrupt his forces' maneuvers. Persian scythe chariots, designed to break infantry formations, were positioned at the front, while the flanks were strengthened with cavalry intended to envelop the smaller Macedonian army. Alexander, approaching with his now battle-hardened force of approximately 47,000, recognized the Persian tactical plan. In a brilliant counter, he deployed his army at an angle to the Persian line and weighted his right wing with his best troops, including the companion cavalry under his personal command. As the battle commenced, Alexander refused his left wing, drawing the Persian right forward, while he led a decisive charge through a gap that opened in the Persian center as their line extended. Once again, Alexander drove directly for Darius himself, calculating correctly that the Persian army's cohesion depended on the king's presence. When Darius fled the field, as at Issus, Persian resistance quickly collapsed despite their still significant numerical advantage. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on October 1st, 331 BCE, effectively ended centralized Persian resistance to Alexander's conquest. The immediate aftermath saw the Macedonian army advancing unopposed to Babylon, where the city's governor made formal submission. Alexander, displaying the political acumen that complemented his military genius, respected Babylonian religious customs and retained many local administrators in their positions. This pattern would be repeated at Susa, the administrative center of the empire, which opened its gates to Alexander in December 331 BCE. In January 330 BCE, Alexander reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. Here, in a dramatic and symbolic act that has been interpreted variously by historians, the palace complex was burned. Some ancient sources attribute this to Alexander's desire for revenge against Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others suggest it was an accident resulting from drunken revelry. Still others see it as a calculated statement that the old order had ended and Persian resistance should cease. Whatever the motivation, the flames that consumed the magnificent structures built by Darius and Xerxes marked the effective end of the Achaemenid era. Darius, meanwhile, had retreated eastward, hoping to rally forces from the still unconquered satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana. His position deteriorated further when Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and a relative of the royal house, conspired with other nobles to depose him. In July 330 BCE, as Alexander's forces drew near, Bessus and his co-conspirators mortally wounded Darius and left him dying by the roadside. The last Achaemenid great king was found by Macedonian scouts, breathing his final breaths. According to the romantic tradition preserved by Greek historians, Alexander himself arrived just in time to cover the dying king with his cloak in a gesture of respect. With Darius's death, the legal framework of the Persian Empire collapsed. Though Bessus proclaimed himself Artaxerxes V and attempted to continue resistance from Bactria, his legitimacy was questionable even among Persians. Alexander, now styling himself as Darius's successor and avenger, pursued the regicides into Central Asia. By 327 BCE, Bessus had been captured, mutilated in Persian fashion for his crime against the king, and executed. All organized Persian resistance had effectively ceased. The speed and completeness of Alexander's conquest, reducing what had been the world's greatest empire to a Macedonian province in less than 5 years, raises profound historical questions. How could a state that had endured for over 2 centuries, with vast resources and sophisticated administrative systems, collapse so rapidly? Part of the answer lies in the cumulative effect of imperial decadence. The later Achaemenid period had seen an increasing focus on court luxury and protocol at the expense of the martial virtues that had characterized the dynasty's founders. The practice of royal seclusion, though enhancing the monarch's mystique, distanced the king from military realities and direct leadership. The growing autonomy of satraps, while administratively expedient, undermined coordinated response to invasion. Yet these structural weaknesses might not have proved fatal against a lesser adversary. Alexander's unique combination of tactical brilliance, strategic vision, personal charisma, and psychological insight into his enemy's vulnerabilities enabled him to systematically dismantle Persian resistance. His ability to maintain momentum, to exploit victories immediately rather than pausing to consolidate, kept the Persian leadership constantly off balance and reactive rather than proactive. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander recognized early that conquering the Persian Empire required more than military victory. It necessitated positioning himself as a legitimate successor to the Achaemenid tradition rather than merely a foreign conqueror. His respectful treatment of the Persian royal family, his adoption of elements of Persian court ceremonial, his retention of capable Persian administrators, and his willingness to incorporate Persian and other Eastern troops into his army all facilitated the relatively smooth transfer of power from one imperial system to another. Indeed, as Alexander consolidated his rule over the former Persian domains in the years following Darius's death, he increasingly presented himself as a universal ruler in the Persian tradition, rather than simply a Macedonian king. He adopted modified versions of Persian royal dress, incorporated Persian nobles into his inner circle, and famously arranged the mass marriage of his officers to Persian noblewomen at Susa in 324 BCE. These policies, while pragmatically facilitating Alexander's rule over a vast multicultural empire, created tensions with his Macedonian companions who had expected to be conquerors rather than partners with the conquered. The growing Orientalization of Alexander's court and his apparent abandonment of purely Macedonian interests led to episodes of unrest among his troops and eventually contributed to the fragmentation of his empire after his premature death in Babylon in 323 BCE. Following Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, who established successor states across the former Persian territories. In Persia itself, the Seleucid dynasty, founded by Alexander's general Seleucus Nicator, would rule for 3 centuries, blending Greek and Persian administrative traditions. Later, the Parthian Empire, founded by nomadic conquerors from the northeastern steppes, would reclaim Persian independence from Hellenic rule while incorporating elements of both Persian and Greek culture. Thus, while the Achaemenid dynasty had fallen, the Persian imperial tradition continued, absorbing foreign elements while maintaining its distinctive character. The administrative structures developed by Darius the Great, the architectural and artistic traditions exemplified at Persepolis, the concepts of universal kingship and cultural tolerance, all would continue to influence subsequent empires from Rome to Byzantium, from the Islamic caliphates to the Mongol domains. As the stars wheel slowly toward morning in the velvet sky above us, we see in this culminating chapter of our story not merely an ending, but a transformation. The Persian Empire, like a great river flowing into the ocean, did not disappear, but rather merged into the broader currents of world history, its waters indistinguishably mixed with those of other great civilizational streams, but still present, still flowing, still shaping the contours of human experience, long after its original source had ceased to exist as a distinct entity. In your mind's eye, as sleep begins to beckon, see once more the glory that was Persepolis, its soaring columns, its magnificent reliefs showing the diversity of peoples united under Persian rule. Though Alexander's conquest brought fire to those halls, the ideas and achievements they represented would prove far more durable than stone and cedar. The Persian legacy would live on, not just in the lands that once formed its domain, but in the very concept of empire itself, a model of multicultural governance that would influence political thought and practice for millennia to come. Chapter 8. The Echoes of Persia. As the first pale light of dawn begins to soften the eastern sky, we come to the final chapter of our journey through the epic of the Persian Empire. Though the Achaemenid Dynasty fell with Darius III, and the magnificent palaces of Persepolis lay in ruins after Alexander's conquest, the legacy of Persia would echo through the corridors of history for millennia to come, influencing civilizations, empires, and cultures far beyond its original boundaries in both space and time. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE saw his vast conquests divided among his generals, the Diadochi, or successors. In the former Persian heartlands, Seleucus Nicator established what would become the Seleucid Empire, ruling from Babylon over territories stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. Though Greek in its elite culture and administrative language, this successor state necessarily incorporated many Persian governmental practices and local traditions to function effectively across such diverse regions. Seleucid rulers maintained the satrapy system developed by Darius, continued the operation of the royal road network, and utilized Persian administrative personnel who possessed irreplaceable local knowledge. Persian nobles were integrated into the new elite, with intermarriage between Greek and Persian aristocratic families becoming increasingly common. The result was a hybrid Greco-Persian court culture that preserved significant elements of Achaemenid tradition beneath a Hellenistic veneer. Yet Persian national identity and imperial memory remained powerful forces, particularly in the Iranian plateau that had been the empire's homeland. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Seleucids faced challenges from two directions that reflected Persian revitalization. In the northeast, the Parthians, an Iranian people originally from the Central Asian steppes, began carving out an independent kingdom. Meanwhile, in Fars province, the Achaemenid heartland, local dynasties maintained semi-autonomous rule. preserving Persian traditions and religious practices. The Parthian challenge ultimately proved decisive. Under their king Mithridates I, circa 171 to 138 BCE, the Parthians expanded from their original territories in northeastern Iran to conquer Media, Babylonia, and eventually most of the former Persian Empire. By 141 BCE, Mithridates had captured the Seleucid king Demetrius II, symbolically reversing the conquest of Darius III by Alexander 3 centuries earlier. The Parthian Empire, which would endure for nearly 5 centuries, circa 247 BCE to 224 CE, represented a conscious revival of Persian imperial traditions blended with elements absorbed from their Hellenic predecessors. Parthian kings adopted the ancient Persian title King of Kings, Shahanshah, and legitimized their rule through connection to Achaemenid precedent. Their administration combined Persian, Seleucid, and Central Asian elements into a flexible system that allowed significant local autonomy while maintaining imperial coherence. Perhaps most significantly, the Parthians positioned themselves as cultural guardians of Persian identity against Hellenic influence. They patronized Zoroastrian religious institutions, revived Persian artistic motifs and architectural styles, and preserved ancient Iranian epic traditions that would later form the basis of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the great Persian national epic. At the same time, they maintained the cosmopolitan character of Persian imperial tradition, incorporating Greek, Babylonian, and other cultural elements within their diverse realm. The Parthian period also saw Persia re-emerge as a major geopolitical player on the world stage. As Rome rose to dominance in the Mediterranean, the Parthian Empire became its principal eastern rival, the only power capable of meeting Roman legions on equal terms. Their victory over Roman forces under Crassus at Carrhae in 53 BCE demonstrated both Parthian military effectiveness and the limits of Roman power, establishing a boundary between the Roman and Iranian spheres of influence that would persist, with modifications, for centuries. The Parthian system eventually gave way to a more deliberately Persian revival under the Sasanian dynasty, founded when Ardashir the Fush overthrew the last Parthian king in 224 CE. The Sasanians claimed direct descent from the Achaemenids and portrayed their empire as the legitimate restoration of Persian greatness after the interval of Seleucid and Parthian rule. Under Sasanian governance, which would last until the Islamic conquests of the 7th century CE, Persian cultural identity crystallized in forms that remain recognizable today. Zoroastrianism was established as the state religion, with fire temples receiving royal patronage and priests wielding significant political influence. The Middle Persian, Pahlavi, language was standardized and utilized for administrative purposes throughout the empire. Persian art and architecture reached new heights of sophistication, exemplified by the magnificent rock-cut reliefs at Naksh-e-Rustam and Tak-e-Bostan, and the innovative architectural solutions of palaces at Ctesiphon and Firuzabad. The Sasanian period also saw the systematic collection and writing down of Persian historical and religious traditions. The Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, was standardized and fixed in written form after centuries of oral transmission. Historical chronicles preserved memories of the Achaemenid era, though often in legendary or mythologized form. Persian mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge was compiled in systematic treatises that would later provide crucial links in the transmission of scientific learning from the ancient to the medieval world. When Arab armies, energized by the new faith of Islam, overthrew the Sasanian Empire in the mid-7th century CE, they conquered the political structure but found themselves profoundly influenced by Persian administrative expertise, artistic traditions, and cultural sophistication. The early Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled much of the Islamic world from 750 to 1258 CE, adopted Persian court ceremonial, administrative techniques, and artistic patterns, often employing Persian officials who possessed irreplaceable institutional knowledge. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, founded in 762 CE, emerged as a center of learning where Persian intellectual traditions merged with Arab, Greek, Indian, and other scholarly currents to create the flowering of knowledge known as the Islamic Golden Age. Persian scholars like al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, made fundamental contributions to mathematics and astronomy. Persian physicians like Xerxes, al-Razi, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, systemized medical knowledge in works that would remain standard texts in European universities into the early modern period. The Islamic period also saw the revival of Persian literature in New Persian, written in Arabic script, but distinctly Iranian in content and sensibility. The 10th century poet Ferdowsi composed the Shahnameh, Book of Kings, an epic of nearly 50,000 couplets, tracing Persian history from mythical times through the Sasanian period, preserving ancient stories and reinforcing Persian cultural identity under Arab political dominance. Poets like Rumi, Hafez, Sa'adi, and Omar Khayyam would later create works of such transcendent beauty and wisdom that they would be treasured far beyond Persian cultural boundaries, influencing literary traditions from Turkey to India, and eventually penetrating Western consciousness. Architecture presents perhaps the most visible manifestation of Persian cultural persistence and influence. The distinctively Persian innovations in dome construction, the 4-Iwan courtyard plan, and the integrated garden designs known as paradisos, from which we derive our word paradise, would spread throughout the Islamic world from Spain to India. The magnificent mosques, palaces, and mausoleums built in Persian style or under Persian influence, from the Shah Mosque in Isfahan to the Taj Mahal in Agra, represent enduring monuments to Persian aesthetic sensibility and technical skill. Even under the rule of Turkic and Mongol dynasties in later centuries, Persian remained the language of culture, administration, and diplomacy across vast stretches of Asia. The courts of the Ottoman sultans, the Mughal emperors, and the Central Asian Khanates all operated in cultural environments deeply influenced by Persian models, employing Persian-speaking officials and patronizing Persian arts. From the 14th to the 19th centuries, a Persian cultural commonwealth stretched from the Balkans to Bengal, transcending political and religious boundaries through shared literary, artistic, and architectural traditions. In more subtle but equally significant ways, Persian influence penetrated Western civilization through multiple transmission paths. Via the Byzantine Empire, elements of Persian court ceremonial, administrative practice, and artistic motifs entered the European cultural stream. The Persian concept of the garden, a formally organized space divided by waterways into 4 sections, symbolizing the 4 rivers of paradise, would influence garden design from Moorish Spain to Renaissance Italy and Enlightenment France. During the European Age of Enlightenment, Persian themes experienced a particular vogue, stimulated by diplomatic contacts and travelers' accounts. Montesquieu's Persian letters used the device of Persian visitors observing French society to offer pointed social criticism. Mozart composed The Abduction from the Seraglio with its pseudo-Turkish Persian setting. Persian motifs appeared in decorative arts, and Persian carpets became prized possessions in aristocratic European households. In the modern era, the archaeological rediscovery of the Achaemenid Empire, beginning with Carsten Niebuhr's copies of cuneiform inscriptions at Persepolis in the late 18th century, continuing through Henry Rawlinson's decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform in the mid-19th century, and culminating in systematic excavations at Persepolis, Pasargadae, and Susa in the 20th century, has allowed contemporary scholarship to better appreciate the remarkable achievements of Cyrus, Darius, and their successors. The Cyrus cylinder, with its declarations of religious tolerance and respect for conquered peoples, has even been characterized as an early human rights charter. Though this interpretation superimposes modern concepts on an ancient artifact. For contemporary Iran, the legacy of the Persian Empire remains a powerful component of national identity and source of cultural pride. The pre-Islamic heritage, particularly the Achaemenid period, provides a touchstone of Persian achievement, independent of later religious developments. Modern Iranian self-understanding incorporates both this ancient imperial legacy and the complex religious, literary, and artistic developments of the medieval and early modern periods, creating a multi-layered cultural identity of remarkable depth and resilience. As our narrative draws to its close and the first rays of sunrise gild the horizon, we might reflect on the deeper significance of the Persian imperial experience within the broader tapestry of human civilization. Beyond the dramatic events, the memorable personalities, and the magnificent artistic achievements we have explored, what enduring lessons might we derive from this ancient story? Perhaps most fundamental was the Persian innovation in imperial governance. Where previous empires had ruled through terror and cultural suppression, the Persian model developed by Cyrus and systematized by Darius demonstrated that diverse peoples could be incorporated into a unified structure while maintaining their cultural, linguistic, and religious identities. This principle of unity through diversity rather than uniformity, of strength derived from complementary differences rather than enforced sameness, represents one of Persia's most significant contributions to political thought. The Persian respect for local traditions and religious practices, exemplified by Cyrus's liberation of the Jews from Babylonian captivity and restoration of their temple vessels, established a model of cultural tolerance that would influence later imperial systems from Alexander's successors to the Romans, and from the Abbasid Caliphate to the Ottoman Empire. In our own era of globalization and multicultural societies, this Persian precedent of managing diversity through accommodation rather than assimilation remains deeply relevant. The Persian administrative innovations, standardized coinage, regularized taxation, efficient communication systems, professional civil service, established templates for effective governance of large territories that would be adopted and adapted by subsequent empires. The concept of delegation of authority to local officials while maintaining central oversight through inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, balanced the benefits of local knowledge with the requirements of imperial cohesion in ways that still resonate in modern federal systems. In cultural terms, Persian willingness to adopt and adapt elements from other civilizations, Elamite administrative techniques, Babylonian scientific knowledge, Egyptian artistic motifs, Greek medical traditions, while maintaining a distinctive Persian identity, demonstrated the creative potential of cultural exchange. Rather than seeing foreign influences as threats to cultural purity, the Persians recognized that selective borrowing and synthesis could strengthen rather than dilute their own traditions, a lesson with particular relevance in our interconnected world. Perhaps most poignantly, the Persian experience illustrates both the remarkable achievements possible through wise governance and the vulnerability of even the greatest political structures to decay through complacency, luxury, and the loss of founding virtues. The contrast between the dynamic empire building of Cyrus and Darius and the court intrigues and succession crises of later reigns offers a cautionary tale about the challenges of maintaining institutional vitality across generations, a challenge faced by all complex societies. Yet the most profound legacy of Persia may lie not in its political structures, which eventually fell to Alexander's armies, but in the cultural traditions that survived and flourished long after the empire's political collapse. The Persian literary, artistic, architectural, and philosophical achievements transcended the boundaries of the empire that had nurtured them, influencing civilizations across Eurasia and through time to our own day. This cultural persistence reminds us that humanistic achievements often outlast political structures, resonating across centuries in ways their creators could never have anticipated. As the light strengthens and our long night's journey through Persian imperial history comes to its end, I hope you carry with you not just the dramatic events and memorable personalities we have encountered, but a deeper appreciation for the Persian contribution to our shared human heritage. From the enlightened policies of Cyrus to the administrative genius of Darius, from the magnificent architecture of Persepolis to the profound poetry of later Persian literary masters, the legacy of Persia enriches our understanding of human potential for creativity, wisdom, and the sophisticated management of diversity. In the gentle transition from night to day, as consciousness drifts between worlds of dream and waking reality, perhaps we might imagine ourselves standing once more on the great terrace at Persepolis. The first light of dawn touches the tops of the remaining columns, making them glow golden against the lightening sky. Though the palace lies largely in ruins, we can sense in these enduring stones the echoes of a civilization whose influence continues to shape our world in countless ways. A civilization whose story, though begun over 2,500 years ago, remains unfinished as its ideas, aesthetics, and wisdom continue to inspire new generations across the global human community. Sleep well, knowing that the greatest achievements of human culture, like those of ancient Persia, are never truly lost, but live on transformed in the ongoing river of civilization that connects us all across the abysses of time and space. In that sense, the Persian Empire never really fell, but merely changed form, its essence persisting like a golden thread woven into the ever-expanding tapestry of human experience. Good night, or perhaps more fittingly, good morning. For with every dawn comes renewal, and with every telling, ancient wisdom finds new life in receptive hearts and minds.